the great pleasure and honor of having Angelo Gurría, the Secretary General of the OECD. Gentlemen, please take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I guess the question everybody really is trying to consider, and which we're going to ask a number of our guests, is whether enough is being done as the Paris Agreement takes effect tomorrow to really achieve the targets that were set out in that agreement. Everybody has an anecdote or incident when they really saw the effects of global warming. In my case, running around Asia as a foreign correspondent, I never forget one scene. I was one of the first foreign correspondents into Tacloban, the Philippines, after Typhoon Haiyan came through, one of the most powerful storms ever, and left the roads covered with the dead and just tremendous devastation. Over 95% of the buildings in the town were destroyed. I'll never forget, there was a young man by the side of the road, and he was writing on a big piece of plywood. And he put one name with an arrow to one side, another name with an arrow to the other side. And I asked him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I've been waiting here with the bodies of my stepson and my wife for 2 days, and there's no food, there's no water, and I'm hoping by putting this sign there between them, somebody will know where to bury them someday because I have to flee the city like everybody else who's fleeing." Now, you see scenes like that in developing countries, and you have to ask, is enough being done to meet these targets? Is enough being done to address the climate change and the more powerful storms, crop failures, and other problems that scientists predict may happen?
Well, first of all, by design, the answer is no, because when we agreed to the Paris Agreement, we knew that we were not making commitments that would lead to the 2-degree warming, much less to the 1.5 degree warming, because if you put all the commitments together of the 185 or whatever it was that committed with the NDCs, those were not enough to lead to the target. But what I think was particularly savvy, and also probably the only way in which it could have been done, and this owes a lot to Laurent Fabius and Ségolène Royal and Laurence Tobiana, etc., the French authorities, even the French president, because I attended, got to know so many summits and so many meetings, and the only thing that the French president was speaking about in the whole year leading up to was that. You know, so they're really focused and really dedicated themselves to making it a success as it happened. But the point is that they then said, okay, we'll hustle a little bit, we'll scatter around, we'll see what happened, and we'll pick up the piece. And in 2018, we'll measure where we are, and then every 5 years after that, we'll be just checking. It's like a GPS. So they created this huge GPS in which many of us are part of the GPS, whether on financing or the emissions or mitigation or adaptation or whatever. And then the GPS is going to tell us whether we are doing enough or not. Now, there's an element of naming and shaming, if you will. But then there's an element of, which means there has to be a systematic and methodologically, accepted way in which you can, account for the efforts that everybody's making, saying, you are behind. Well, behind what? Well, the only thing that you can refer to now is the NDC, their commitment in Paris. When, after the first 5 or the second 5 years, we come to the conclusion that we're not making enough progress, even to deliver those targets, then we'll start to get really, worried. And we have to hopefully get worried before that. But on the other hand, the question is, the victims of Hurricane Haiyan, and the story is heartbreaking, but those are not the guys who are going to make or break the emissions. The number of the emissions will work if the largest countries in the world, the largest emitters, deliver. And that's mostly the United States and China. And I would say mostly China for the reason that the United States is inevitably going to be moving towards a lower and lower and lower emissions culture, a lower and lower emissions legislation, a lower and lower emissions, almost, I would say, if it's not legally enforced, and it will be if we don't make enough progress fast enough, there will be such pressure, even social pressure. And Ségolène mentioned briefly the fact that they had legislated that companies now have to disclose how carbonic their balance sheets are. France was the first to go in this direction, although a number of other countries have mandated disclosure in different ways, except it's all over the place. Now Michael Bloomberg is heading a group of businessmen which are trying to look at how they could recommend that this be regulated and therefore homogenized, so that when we're talking about certain units and certain this, how green are you? You know, that they compete to see whether, how many, you know, do they employ women? Are they equal opportunity employers? You know, so that they compete also on the question of greening, but also to protect investors, so that if somebody is investing in a company and it happens that that company has some assets that are going to have to be stranded because they can't use them because of the legislation or because of the political pressure or because nobody's going to finance the plants, etc., as it's already happening, then, of course, what you're going to happen is, again, that's going to be accelerated. In Europe, it already happened. So the point is, it's going to be large emerging economies which are going to be crucial for the delivery of this. And there we need to provide both the technology, to some extent, financing, and also a sense of, you know, the responsibility that they have to take for the rest of the world.
You mentioned stranded assets, you mentioned carbon disclosure. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has expressed concern that if transition and energy transition happens too quickly, we could even see systemic risk to the financial markets, to the financial system. Is that a concern for you, or if anything, do you worry more about the other extreme, which is that we're not going to move fast enough at this point?
No, Mark was Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, but also chairman of the FSB, the Financial Stability Board. You know, we sometimes feel like we are like a stand-up comedians convention. You say 17 and everybody laughs. And so these acronyms, this FSB is what, so Mr. Carney is more than simply, well, not simply, but governor of the Bank of England. He has this systemic responsibility to the G20 about the regulatory aspect, the regulatory environment. And he was the one who commissioned Michael Bloomberg to form this group in order to deliver on some proposals so that companies can actually do their thing. Yesterday, the French government awarded the Legion of Honor to Paul Polman, the head of Unilever. And again, his great contribution was the fact that he's leading the private sector in order to deliver. Again, I have no doubt this is going to carry. More and more of these companies are going to do it because there are enough enlightened leaders, and some of the people are already, I would say, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund no longer invests in companies that have carbon, in their balance sheets, or and a bunch of others are starting to. So this is, as I said, it's happening over here. I'm not worried about the impact on the companies themselves, for example. I think green is a wonderful source of business, which has not yet started to be explored. We got to get the finance right, that's a pending issue. But I'm more worried about the fact that a number of companies, because of lack, and that would be mostly in, again, developing and emerging economies, because of lack of enforcement or because of teeth in the enforcement, and because of maybe their state-owned enterprises, or because of that they are not going to be subject to the same kind of discipline, which would introduce two distortions. First, they would continue to emit, and the second, they could distort the level playing field
Exactly.
when everybody else is doing the effort. And it could be used by those who are not yet convinced. But I don't think there's going to be a lot of room. I mean, you guys are going to be, fighting the fight there. You're going to be telling everybody the way to go. And so is the media, the rest of the media, and so are practically every single source of public opinion, or those who influence public opinion. So as I say, I have a lot more confidence in that this will go well in let's say the OECD countries vis-a-vis the rest, where I have more of a question mark, including the financing.
Mr. Royal was mentioning green finance for hopes that Paris might become a center of it. You and I were both at the Shanghai G20 finance ministers, where China made the promotion of green finance one of the goals for this year's G20. Do you feel as though enough has been done and enough specificity has been given to this process at the multilateral level to foster more green bonds, more other instruments of green finance?
Well, for example, green bonds, okay? Green bonds went from 10 to 20 to 40. I think we've now gone 50, 60 or something like that. And we're talking about two different sources of financing. The ones that are going to be used, the 100 billion that are going to be used, which you alluded to, which we calculated the path, in order to get to the developing countries to help them deliver their commitments, okay? The other one is not a question of billions. The other one is a question of trillions, which is all the necessary investments that are happening every day simply to keep up with the demand of energy. And then the change in the energy patterns and the energy renewals, and some decisions like Germany, which decided that they will close their nuclear plants.
Yes.
And they're massively substituting with renewables, very admirable. Or what happened in China 2 days ago. 30 coal-fired plants will no longer be built. The problem is many more that
Will be built.
But the question is, okay, that's 17 gigawatts or thereabouts. That's massive. It's a very, very large amount of electricity that will not be coal-fired. And it will happen because they need it. But it means it will be fired with, it'll be fueled with something else. The dismantling of the subsidies. I mean, Mr. Simon Upton, who's director of the environment at the OECD, wrote a book called Aligning Policies for a Low Carbon Economy, which basically says we're trying to reduce emissions over here. And over here, we're doing all these things which promote emissions, fossil fuels, subsidies, we're flotillas, all sorts of things that, just make it easy and cheaper, and tax breaks. And, well, because, some of these things are on the books since the crisis or even before. And we wanted to stimulate the economy. We didn't think very much about, the environment, because kind of a luxury we afforded. So the problem is we have to do both. And a lot of these things are still in the books. So again, it's a question of consistency. And then the basic question of, are the projects good enough? Is the regulatory framework predictable and stable enough? And then is there a big, fat pricing on carbon? Yes. Okay, this is my most policy-based, evidence-based scientific statement. Big, fat price on carbon, okay? Now, how big and how fat? Well, we have here the Swedish ambassador to the OECD, who will witness the fact that they have 117 euros per ton of avoided CO2 equivalent. And Ségolène Royal was mentioning that they are starting at 30, which is kind of the calculated price of the damage that this does, on average, at least. And that then, to influence conduct, they will go to 40 to 50, and that they will be at 100 as soon as 2030, which is around the corner. Now, that's great news, That's great news. But many of the Europeans are still trying their ETSs, their emissions trading schemes, and that gives single-digit prices. And they failed 4 times. Why do they continue to do these things, you know? Well, basically because what I'm being told every time I ask, I'm being told because politicians don't like the word tax. I say, the problem is it's not good enough. The reason it's not good enough. The damage is too great. And also, it's dysfunctional. It's not working. It's simply not working. It's not producing, these ETSs are not producing the prices that will change conduct. And also because the base price has dropped so much with the halving of the price of oil. Then, of course, even with these, and add these little modest little bits and pieces with the ETSs, it doesn't change. It's lower than before. So actually, you buy a big Hummer or something like that, just you buy a big SUV because it's cheaper today.
And there's not much of
it's all the wrong things.
As Minister Royal mentioned, €6 a ton now is the trading price in some of the European markets.
And they'll take it to 100, which is good news.
Yes.
But it doesn't happen market, and it doesn't happen because you establish an ETS. It happens because you make a policy decision. This is policy-driven. This is policy-driven. Did I say it was policy-driven? No.
It is absolutely.
Nothing will happen. Nothing will happen spontaneously. You need to make very definitive, very deliberate policy decisions and choices, and then make them into a law, and then enforce it. This is the way in which each one of the countries will. And there, I can imagine a clearing system where we can create. We just created a center for the climate finance, and which we announced in Kyoto and in Tokyo a few weeks ago. Again, we can create these clearance systems for information, for best practices, etc. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to add everything that we collectively know, and also give courage to each other. One country will move if they know the others are moving, and if they know the others are moving, and if they don't want to be left out.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why don't we move on now from a big fat price on carbon to somebody who really